The summer of 1863 was a shroud of humid air and unshakable dread over the fields of rural Iowa. The wind, when it came, carried not the scent of hay but the faint coppery tang of distant conflict, a ghost on the prairie breeze. Jeremiah Whitlock, a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving earth he farmed, watched the cornstalks sway with a vacant stare. His mind was miles away, across the Mississippi, where the war raged. It had taken his eldest son, Thomas, and left a hollowness in its place that no amount of work could fill. His two remaining daughters, Eleanor, 20, and Lillian, 18, were the only solace in his desolate world, and even that was a fragile thing. The sisters were two halves of a fractured whole. Eleanor, the elder, possessed a quiet intensity, a stillness that made her seem older than her years. Her hands, though calloused from work, moved with a delicate precision as she tended the garden or mended torn clothes. Lillian, on the other hand, was a burst of nervous energy, her laughter quick and her movements restless. She was the one who still sang hymns in the kitchen, a habit that had slowly faded since Thomas's last letter. The family lived in a simple, two-story farmhouse, its wood weathered and gray. A deep, oppressive silence had settled over it, broken only by the creak of the floorboards and the low hum of the cicadas. This silence was more chilling than any sound could be. It was the sound of a family holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The sickness had started a week ago. Not a fever, not a cough, but a change. A subtle, insidious shift in their father. Jeremiah had always been a stern, solitary man, his affection for his children buried deep beneath a farmer's reserve. But lately, his solitude had become something else entirely. He would sit for hours on the porch, staring at nothing, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He ate little, spoke less, and his eyes, once the pale blue of a summer sky, had taken on a murky, distant quality. He moved through the house like a ghost, his presence a heavy weight in every room. Lillian was the first to voice her fear. One evening, as they were darning socks by the light of a flickering oil lamp, she leaned close to Eleanor, her voice a whisper. "He's not himself, El. He hasn't been since the telegram." Eleanor nodded, her needle pausing. "I know. The grief, it's a terrible thing." "It's not just grief," Lillian insisted, her eyes wide. "It's something else. He looks at us differently, like we're strangers or worse, like we're property." A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. She dismissed the feeling. "He's our father, Lil. We must be strong for him. He lost his son." The next day, the sickness deepened. Jeremiah began to keep them close, too close. He insisted they eat every meal together at the small wooden table in the kitchen, and he would watch them, not with the loving eye of a father, but with an unnerving, proprietary gaze. He forbade them from venturing into town, claiming the roads were no longer safe with so many men away at war. The lie was flimsy. The road to the nearest settlement was a well-worn path, and their neighbors, the Andersons, traveled it regularly without incident. The first ritual, if it could be called that, began subtly. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Jeremiah called them to the parlor. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and the air was heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. He sat them on the floor before the unlit hearth. "I want you to talk," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Tell me about your thoughts, your desires." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced at Lillian, who looked as terrified as she felt. "Father, what do you mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jeremiah's eyes fixed on her. "I mean what I say. A family must share everything, to be truly close, to be one." For the next hour they spoke haltingly, forced to share banal details about their day, their hopes for a good harvest, the recipes they wished to try. But Jeremiah's questions grew more intimate, more probing, forcing them into a space of discomfort and shame. He didn't seem to listen to their words so much as to the rhythm of their fear. He took a strange satisfaction in their discomfort, a cruel glint in his eyes that had never been there before. When he finally dismissed them, the two sisters fled to their room, locking the door behind them. "I can't," Lillian whispered, burying her face in her hands. "I can't pretend this is normal, Elle. This isn't grief, it's evil." Eleanor didn't have an answer. The world outside their door had become a foreign land, and the man who was their father was its silent, watchful king. The shadows of the approaching storm stretched across the floor, long and dark, and for the first time, Eleanor wished she was a man, so she could have gone to war and never looked back. That night, the storm broke, a ferocious onslaught of wind and rain. The thunder rattled the windows and lightning illuminated the room in stark, frightening flashes. Eleanor, lying in her bed, listened to the storm and to the silence from downstairs, a silence that felt heavy with a secret too terrible to name. The horrors of war had not touched their home, but something else had. It had slipped in, quiet as a shadow, and had begun to fester in the mind of their father. The true battle was not on some distant field, but right here, within these walls, and Eleanor and Lillian were the only soldiers. The storm outside was a mere echo of the tempest that had begun to brew inside the house, a tempest that promised to break them both. This is just the beginning of a long journey, and it's essential for us to stay together to see it through. If you're invested in the fate of the Whitlock sisters and want to uncover the dark secrets of their family, please consider subscribing to the channel. The following morning, the sun rose on a world washed clean, but the air inside the Whitlock house was still thick with the residue of the storm, both meteorological and psychological. They were trapped, and the sickness was just beginning. The day after the storm was one of deceptive calm. The sun, a brilliant disk in a cloudless sky, baked the fields and dried the mud. But inside the Whitlock farmhouse, a new, more pervasive gloom had settled. Jeremiah's rituals became a daily occurrence. He would call the sisters to the parlor, and the sessions grew longer, more demanding. He no longer simply asked questions, he made pronouncements. He began to speak of purification, of cleansing the family soul from the sin of modern indulgences. His words, once the stern but familiar language of a man of God, had warped into a twisted private theology. He claimed that the war was a divine punishment for the moral decay of the nation, and that their family had been chosen to atone. He spoke of their bodies not as their own, but as vessels for this holy work. The sisters, terrified and isolated, could only listen, their eyes downcast, their silence a fragile shield. Lillian, whose spirit had once been so bright, began to fray at the edges. She would jump at the slightest sound, and her laughter had become a strained, thin thing. One afternoon, while kneading dough in the kitchen, her hands started to shake uncontrollably. She dropped the bowl, and it shattered on the floor, the flour blooming like a white cloud. Jeremiah appeared in the doorway, his presence a chilling stillness. He didn't yell. He just watched, his gaze a cold, assessing weight. "Such clumsiness," he said, his voice low. "A weak mind makes for weak hands." He then made her kneel and pick up every shard of pottery one by one, watching her with that same unsettling gaze until she finished. The message was clear. There was no room for weakness in his house. Eleanor, a more resilient soul, tried to find a way to resist. She considered running, but where would they go? The nearest town was miles away, and they had no money, no connections. The fear of what their father might do if they tried to escape was a heavy chain around their ankles. Their isolation was his greatest weapon. They were his captives, not in a locked room but in a psychological prison built of fear and the unspoken threat of violence. One evening Jeremiah had them sit opposite him in the parlor. The oil lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. "It's time," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "to take the next step in our purification. The flesh is weak and must be humbled." He then instructed them to remove their shoes and stockings. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at Lillian, whose face was a mask of sheer terror. "Father, please," Lillian whimpered, but the words died in her throat under his piercing gaze. Hesitantly, with trembling hands, they obeyed. The cold floorboards were a shock against their bare skin. Jeremiah then took a small silver sewing needle from his pocket. He held it up to the lamplight, and its tip glinted like a tiny, malevolent star. "The body must be reminded of its subservience to the spirit," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It must be taught humility." He began to prick the soles of their feet, not to draw blood, but to inflict a sharp, stinging pain. He did it with a methodical, almost ceremonial air, watching their faces as they flinched, stifling their cries. The pain was minor, but the act itself was a deep violation, a chilling reminder of his complete control over them. He was not just their father, he was their tormentor, a god in their small, suffocating universe. When he was done, he looked at them, a strange, satisfied light in his eyes. "You see," he said, "the body can be made to obey. The spirit can be made pure." After he left, the sisters huddled together on the floor, their feet throbbing, their hearts pounding. Lillian sobbed silently, her body shaking with a profound, bone-deep fear. Eleanor held her, her own mind a whirlwind of terror and rising, dangerous rage. This was no longer just about grief or a father losing his mind. This was something darker, something predatory. Eleanor's thoughts turned to Thomas, her brave, kind brother. She remembered his last visit home, his earnest face as he told them about the war, the glint of pride in his eyes when their father had called him a man. The contrast between that memory and their current reality was a bitter, searing pain. Her grief for Thomas was now intertwined with a growing fear for herself and Lillian. The war had not taken just her brother. It had also broken the man who was their father, leaving behind a stranger, a monster. In the dead of night, Eleanor crept to the kitchen, her feet still sore from the pricks of the needle. She needed something, a weapon, a tool, anything. Her hand found a heavy iron skillet. The weight of it was a comfort, a solid, tangible thing in a world that had become fluid and terrifying. She held it for a long time, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning anger in her heart. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now tempered with a new, steel-like resolve. She would not let this continue. She would find a way to protect her sister, to free them both. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the distant cries of a lone owl, but she felt a different kind of quiet within her now. A dangerous, cold resolve had taken root. The sickness was not a fleeting madness. It was a calculated, deliberate evil, and Eleanor knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it was only going to get worse. Days turned into weeks, each one a slow, agonizing slide deeper into Jeremiah's twisted reality. His rituals became more frequent and more bizarre. The sessions in the parlor now involved him dictating their every movement, every action, forcing them to perform mundane tasks with a chilling, theatrical solemnity. He would have them meticulously polish the same piece of furniture for hours or arrange and rearrange books on a shelf until they were perfectly aligned. He claimed it was to purge the chaos of the world from their minds. But the sisters knew it was simply to exert his total control. Lillian was a ghost of her former self. Her nervous energy was gone, replaced by a deep, weary resignation. She moved through the house with a listless, vacant expression, her eyes dark and hollow. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a thin, barely audible thread. Eleanor tried to reach her, to offer comfort and hope, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The fear had consumed her body and soul. Eleanor, however, was still fighting. She kept her fear hidden behind a stoic facade, her mind working constantly, searching for an escape. She began to observe her father's habits, looking for a weakness, an opening. She noticed he spent an unusual amount of time in the attic. He would go up there every day, sometimes for hours, and the door would be locked from the inside. Her curiosity, a mix of desperate hope and chilling dread, finally outweighed her fear. One morning after Jeremiah had gone out to the fields, Eleanor told Lillian she was going to the barn to gather eggs, a simple lie to buy her time. She crept up the stairs, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The attic door was ajar, a small detail she knew her father, with his obsessive need for order, would never have allowed. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. He was testing her. He knew she would be curious. She pushed the door open, the old wood groaning in protest. The air in the attic was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something else. Something sickly sweet, like rotting flowers. She saw a small trunk, its lock broken, sitting in the middle of the room. A strange collection of objects was scattered around it. Old photographs of her and Lillian from when they were children, a small porcelain doll Lillian had treasured, and a leather-bound journal. Her hands shook as she reached for the journal. The pages were filled with her father's neat, meticulous handwriting. It was not a journal in the traditional sense. It was a record, a chilling, detailed chronicle of his descent. He had written about the sickness, but he didn't call it that. He called it the awakening. He wrote of a newfound clarity, a realization that his family was unclean and that his purpose, his holy mission, was to purify them. The words were a horrifying mosaic of religious fanaticism and profound personal delusions. He wrote of his belief that his son Thomas's death was a sacrifice, a divine sign that he must now sacrifice something of his own to God. The words were not just insane, they were malevolent, filled with a cold, terrifying logic. He had methodically planned his actions, seeing his cruelty as a holy act. Eleanor read with growing horror, her eyes scanning the pages as if in a trance. She saw entries detailing the pricks of the needle, describing the sisters' fear as a holy terror and their silent obedience as submission to God's will. But the entry that made her blood run cold was the most recent one. It was a diagram, a sketch of a strange, complex ritual. The words, "Final Purification," were scrawled beneath it. She saw her and Lillian's names written on the diagram, their roles in the ritual chillingly clear. She heard a sound from downstairs, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. He was back. Panic seized her. She slammed the journal shut, her hands fumbling to put the objects back as they were. But it was too late. Jeremiah's heavy footsteps were on the stairs. He didn't come to the attic door. He stopped on the second-floor landing. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. She heard a low, throaty laugh from downstairs, a sound she had never heard him make. It was not a sound of mirth, but of pure, unadulterated madness. She knew then that he had left the door ajar on purpose, that he had wanted her to see, to be a part of his sick, monstrous game. He was no longer just a captor, he was a manipulator, a psychological predator. Eleanor crept back down the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest, the image of the final purification branded on her mind. She found him sitting in his armchair, a faint, cruel smile on his face. He didn't mention the attic. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes told her he knew. She had sought an answer and found only a deeper, more chilling mystery. Her father wasn't sick. He was evil, and he had a plan. The silence of the house was now a different kind of monster, a silence of a ticking clock, counting down to a climax she didn't want to imagine. After the discovery of the journal, a new dynamic settled over the house. Jeremiah became more withdrawn, his pronouncements less frequent, but his presence was a constant, suffocating weight. He would sit and watch the sisters from the shadows, his eyes following their every move. The silence was now filled with a sinister expectation, a quiet menace that was far worse than any outburst. Eleanor and Lillian moved through their days in a state of perpetual dread, their every action a performance for their watchful, silent audience. One night, as a cool breeze rattled the window panes, Lillian whispered to Eleanor, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor, her eyes half closed from exhaustion, shook her head. "Hear what, Lil?" "The whispers," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "They're in the wall." Eleanor listened. All she heard was the wind and the creaking of the old house. "It's just the house settling," she said, her voice a hollow comfort. But Lillian shook her head vehemently. "No, Elle, I know what the house sounds like. This is different. It's a voice. A man's voice. I think it's him. I think he's talking to us from behind the wall." Eleanor was chilled by the thought, but she dismissed it as a product of Lillian's unraveling mind. Her sister was seeing and hearing things that weren't there. The stress and fear had finally broken her. The next day, however, Eleanor heard it too. A faint, unintelligible murmur coming from the wall that separated their bedroom from the main staircase. It was too low to make out the words, but it was there. A steady, rhythmic cadence. She pressed her ear against the wall, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. It was a man's voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She backed away from the wall, her blood running cold. It wasn't their father. His room was at the other end of the hall. Lillian, who had been sitting on her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, looked at her with a knowing, terrified expression. "I told you," she whispered. Eleanor's mind raced. It couldn't be their father. He wasn't even home. She had seen him ride out to the fields an hour ago. The sound was impossible, and yet it was there. She went back to the wall, her ear pressed to the cool plaster. The whispering grew louder, and this time she could make out a few fragmented words. They were strange, distorted, and seemed to be about a new family and a special gift. It was gibberish, but it was a gibberish that filled her with a profound sense of dread. She moved her hand along the wall, feeling for a loose board, a hidden panel, anything. Her fingers found a small, almost imperceptible notch near the floor. She knelt down and pushed, and a small wooden panel popped open, revealing a dark, narrow space. A small black box sat inside, covered in a thick layer of dust. The whispers stopped the moment she opened the panel. Eleanor reached inside, her hand trembling. The box was small and heavy, and its surface was cold and smooth. She took it out and placed it on the floor. It was made of polished wood, with a small brass lock on the front. She didn't have a key. She tried to pry it open, but the box was solid and unyielding. The whispers started again, this time from a different place in the room, and they were louder, more urgent. It was as if something was speaking to her through the walls, warning her away from the box. Jeremiah returned at dusk, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He didn't mention the panel, but his eyes when he looked at her were filled with a strange, dark amusement. That night Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat in the darkness, the black box hidden beneath her mattress, the whispers in the walls, a constant, maddening hum. She knew the box was the key to everything, to her father's madness, to the secrets of the house, to their only hope of escape. The next morning she asked Lillian, "Where's the key to the box?" Lillian just shook her head, her face a mask of terror. "I don't know, Elle, but I know what's in there. It's the whispers." Eleanor knew she was losing her mind, but she also knew her sister was not entirely wrong. The whispers had led her to the box, and the whispers were something real, something she and Lillian could both hear. The source of the voice, the secret of the box, and the terrifying truth behind her father's madness were all intertwined. Eleanor felt a cold, hard resolve settle in her heart. She would find the key. She would open the box. She had to. The whispers were getting louder, and she had a terrible feeling that they were not just a warning. They were a countdown. The hunt for the key was a tense, silent game of cat and mouse. Eleanor was meticulous in her search, her mind a steel trap, observing her father's every move. He kept the keys to the house and the barn on a simple ring, always on his person. She knew she couldn't simply steal them. He was too watchful, too suspicious. She needed an opportunity, a moment of distraction, a small window in his carefully constructed world of control. Days passed in this stifling, silent atmosphere. The rituals continued, but with a new, unsettling twist. Jeremiah would now have them participate in strange, silent ceremonies. He would have them sit on the floor, their hands clasped in their laps, and he would walk around them, his bare feet making no sound on the floorboards, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to read their very souls. The whispers in the walls continued as well, a low, maddening hum that followed them from room to room. One afternoon, a neighbor, a grizzled old farmer named Silas, came by to ask Jeremiah about a shared fence line. It was a rare, blessed intrusion from the outside world. Jeremiah, forced to be civil, met Silas outside. Eleanor seized her chance. She crept into the parlor where her father had been sitting, her heart pounding. The keyring was on the mantelpiece, a small, dark object against the light grey wood. She moved with a silent, desperate speed, her fingers reaching for the ring, but just as she touched it, she heard a sound from the kitchen, a sharp intake of breath. Lillian, her sister, was watching her, a look of profound terror on her face. Her eyes darted from Eleanor to the keys and back again, a silent plea for her to stop. Eleanor hesitated. She knew her sister's fear was not just of their father, but of what she herself was doing. To act, to rebel, was to acknowledge their captivity, to risk everything. But she couldn't stop now. She had to know what was in that box. The whispers in the wall were a constant, nagging reminder that time was running out. She took the keys, her hand closing around them, the metal cold and heavy. She then went back to her room, the small wooden box waiting for her. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking until she found the right one. The lock clicked open with a soft, final sound. She lifted the lid, and the whispers in the walls suddenly stopped. A cold, heavy silence filled the room. Inside the box was not a treasure, not money, but something far more chilling. It was a collection of personal items, a small silver locket with a faded photograph of her mother, who had died years ago. A lock of her own hair she remembered her father cutting when she was a little girl, and a small rusted pocket knife that had belonged to Thomas. But the most disturbing item was a small, ornate key. It was not a key for a door or a lockbox. It was a key for a human-sized coffin, the kind of key a mortician might use to lock a casket before burial. Her blood ran cold. The whispers, the rituals, the purification, it all clicked into place with a horrifying, stomach-churning finality. Her father wasn't just a man losing his mind to grief. He was a man consumed by a monstrous, premeditated plan. He had been preparing for their deaths. A sound on the stairs made her heart leap into her throat. Jeremiah. He was coming back. She slammed the box shut, the lock clicking home with a sound that felt final, irrevocable. She scrambled to put the key ring back on the mantelpiece. She was halfway down the stairs when he came into the hallway, his face an unreadable mask. "Did you find what you were looking for, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice a low, chilling whisper. She froze, her mind a frantic scramble for an answer. "I was looking for a book, Father," she stammered, her voice a thin, shaky lie. He said nothing. He simply stared at her, his eyes filled with a cruel, knowing light. He knew. He had known the entire time. He had left the panel ajar on purpose. He had put the keys on the mantelpiece on purpose. He was playing a game, a terrible, sadistic game, and she had just walked right into his trap. He took a step towards her, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. "The only book you need, Eleanor, is the one I am writing for you." He then turned and walked back into the parlor, leaving her standing there. The weight of the coffin key, a heavy, terrifying presence in her mind. He wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning a burial, and he had a key for it. The discovery of the coffin key had a transformative effect on Eleanor. The fear that had once been a paralyzing weight was now a cold, crystalline resolve. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor. She knew what her father was planning, and she knew she had to stop him, not just for herself, but for Lillian, who was teetering on the edge of sanity. Her focus shifted from escape to confrontation. She needed to understand his full plan, to find the burial place, the place where he intended to purify them. She began to pay closer attention to his every move, every word, searching for clues, for any hint of his monstrous intentions. She noticed a new pattern in his behavior. He was spending a significant amount of time in the cellar, not just for chores, but for long, secretive periods. He had begun to lock the cellar door from the outside, a detail she had never noticed before. One evening, as the moon cast long, ghostly shadows on the farmhouse, Eleanor waited for her father to go to bed. She then crept downstairs, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the coffin key a cold, hard presence in her pocket. She went to the cellar door, and with a silent prayer, tried the key. It slid into the lock, a perfect fit, and the lock clicked open with a soft, final sound. She opened the door, and a cold, musty air rushed out. She lit a single oil lamp, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The cellar was damp and smelled of earth and mold, but her eyes were drawn to a newly dug section of the dirt floor. There, in the center of the cellar, was a large rectangular pit, a fresh scar on the earth. And in the pit sat two handmade coffins, crudely carved from pine, their lids open, like waiting mouths. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. Her blood ran cold, and the air seemed to be sucked from her lungs. She looked inside the coffins. They were lined with white linen, and in each one a small porcelain doll was placed, one with a blonde-haired doll and one with a brunette-haired one, a chilling representation of her and her sister. He had made them himself. The detail, the care he had put into this monstrous creation was a different kind of horror, far worse than any spontaneous act of violence. It was premeditated, planned, and utterly deranged. As she stood there, her body frozen with a profound, bone-deep terror, she heard a sound from the top of the stairs. Jeremiah. He was standing there, his face half hidden in the shadows, his eyes glinting in the faint lamplight. "You were right to come down, Eleanor," he said, his voice a calm, chilling monotone. "The truth must be revealed before the final purification can take place." He walked down the stairs, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He was not angry. He was calm, a man at peace with his terrible mission. "I have been chosen," he said, his voice a low, zealous whisper. "Chosen to bring the family back to God. Thomas was the first sacrifice, the first to be cleansed of sin. And now, it is your turn." He walked past her and stood by the coffins, his hand resting on the smooth wood. "They are perfect, aren't they? I made them myself. The finest pine, the purest linen, the perfect final resting place for pure souls." Eleanor, her voice trembling, finally spoke. "Father, what are you doing? This is madness." He looked at her, and the light in his eyes was not of madness, but of a terrifying, absolute conviction. "Madness is living a life of sin. This is salvation. This is my legacy, my family pure and whole again." He then made a gesture towards the coffins, a final, terrible invitation. "It's time, my daughters. It's time to be one with God." Lillian, who had been standing behind her father, her face a mask of profound, unadulterated terror, now whimpered. "No, please, father, no." He ignored her, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. He held out his hand, an offering of death, a final command. Eleanor knew she had a choice. She could give in, let her fear consume her, and allow him to do what he had planned. Or she could fight. She looked at Lillian, her sister's face a silent plea for rescue. And then she looked at the coffins, and the cold reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had to fight. She had to save them both. The mystery had been solved, the horror unveiled. Now, the final act, the climax of their long, terrifying story, was about to begin. The air in the cellar was thick with the scent of damp earth and the chilling presence of death. Eleanor, her hand still clenching the small coffin key, took a step back. her eyes fixed on her father. She had seen the madness in his eyes, but now she saw something new, a terrifying, unshakable calm. He was a man with a purpose, a man who believed he was doing God's work. This wasn't an act of spontaneous violence. It was a ritual, a ceremony he had been planning for months. "Please, Father," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but firm. "Think about what you're doing. This isn't what God wants. He wants us to live, to love each other." Jeremiah shook his head slowly, his lips curving into a thin, unholy smile. "You are speaking the devil's tongue, Eleanor. Love is a sin when it is selfish. My love for you and your sister is pure. It is a love that will cleanse your souls and grant you eternal peace." He took a step towards her, and Lillian, her body trembling, let out a small, terrified sob. "No, please, Daddy, don't," she cried, her voice a thin, reedy thread. Jeremiah's eyes snapped to Lillian, and his face for a brief moment was filled with a chilling, cold disgust. "Silence, girl. Your fear is a weakness. You must be strong. You must embrace salvation." Eleanor knew she couldn't reason with him. He was too far gone. She had to fight. She glanced at the wall behind her, her mind racing. The cellar was small, cluttered with tools and old furniture. A shovel leaned against the wall, its head caked with dirt. A glint of hope, small but bright, flickered in her chest. "Father," she said, her voice a distraction, a tool. "Thomas wouldn't want this. He loved us." The mention of Thomas's name caused a flicker of emotion in Jeremiah's eyes, a brief, fleeting moment of pain. It was all the opening Eleanor needed. She lunged for the shovel, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal handle. With a desperate heave, she swung the shovel, not to strike him, but to block his path. The shovel head hit the wall with a loud, jarring clang, and the sound echoed in the small space, a violent protest against the silence. The sudden sound broke the spell. Lillian, her fear finally giving way to a desperate, primal need to survive, ran to the far end of the cellar, her hands fumbling with the latch of a small wooden crate. Jeremiah, startled by the noise, turned his attention back to Eleanor, his face a mask of rage. "You will not resist me, Eleanor. You will not deny your own salvation." He lunged at her, his hands like claws, but she was faster. She swung the shovel again, this time with a wild, desperate energy. The shovel head hit his shoulder, and he grunted in pain, stumbling back. He was a strong man, but years of grief and madness had taken their toll. He was not as fast as he used to be. The whispers in the walls returned, louder than ever, a frantic, maddening chorus. They seemed to fill the cellar, to press in on them from all sides. They were no longer a hum, they were a roar, a violent, desperate sound that seemed to be warning them, to be cheering them on. "I am not afraid of you," Eleanor screamed, her voice hoarse with fear and adrenaline. "You are not a man of God. You are a monster." He lunged at her again, and she swung the shovel, but he was prepared this time. He caught the handle, and they were locked in a desperate tug-of-war. His eyes were wide and wild, filled with a crazed, unholy light. "I am your father. You will obey." Lillian, who had managed to open the crate, now let out a small gasp. She pulled out a large, heavy coil of rope, and her face, for the first time in weeks, was filled with a semblance of a plan, a glimmer of hope. "Eleanor, the rope, tie him." Eleanor, with a final, desperate burst of strength, twisted the shovel, yanking it from his grasp. He stumbled back, and she used the momentum to push him against the wall. Lillian, with a speed born of pure terror, wrapped the rope around his ankles, and with Eleanor's help, they managed to trip him, bringing him to the ground with a sickening thud. They worked together, their hands fumbling but efficient, tying him to a heavy wooden post that held up the ceiling. He thrashed and screamed, his words a stream of religious nonsense and personal insults. "Unclean, disobedient, sinners." When they were done, he was a captive, a madman tied to a post, his eyes still burning with a crazed, unholy light. Eleanor and Lillian stood over him, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and shock. They had done it. They had survived. The whispers in the walls finally stopped, and a profound, bone-deep silence settled over the cellar. But the silence was not a comfort. It was a new kind of terror, the silence of a man's mind, a mind that had been broken beyond repair. This is a journey that is far from over. There are still many chapters to be written in this terrifying story. If you're invested in the fate of the Whitlock sisters and want to know what happens next, please consider subscribing to the channel. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The real terror had just begun. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of exhaustion and a surreal, disbelieving calm. Eleanor and Lillian sat in the cellar, watching their father. He was silent now, his rage having been spent. He simply sat there, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, his face an unreadable mask of defeat. The two sisters, their bodies and minds still humming with adrenaline, tried to process what had just happened. They had fought their own father and won. It was a victory, but it was a victory that left them feeling hollow and utterly terrified. Lillian was the first to speak. Her voice, a thin whisper, cut through the oppressive silence. "What do we do now, Elle? We can't leave him here." Eleanor's mind was racing. She knew they couldn't just leave him. They had to get help. But who would believe them? They were two young girls who had tied up their own father, a respected farmer in the community. The town was miles away, and the closest neighbor, old Silas, was a good man, but he was also a man of his time, and he would likely be suspicious, if not outright dismissive. They decided to leave him for the night. They couldn't untie him, not with the memory of his crazed eyes still fresh in their minds. They left him with a bucket of water and a loaf of bread, a desperate, futile attempt at a normal human gesture. They then locked the cellar door and went upstairs, locking their bedroom door behind them. The night was a restless, terrifying thing. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made them jump. Eleanor, lying in her bed, her mind replaying the scene in the cellar, finally understood the full, chilling extent of her father's plan. The whispers in the walls, the rituals, the bizarre behavior. It had all been a preamble to a final act, a gruesome act of murder-suicide he had planned as a purification. The coffin key was not just for them, it was for him too. He had meant to bury all three of them in that dark, cold pit. In the morning, a new, terrible reality settled over the house. Their father was their prisoner. He was a monster, but he was also their father. The conflict was a heavy, suffocating thing. They went down to the cellar to check on him. He was still tied to the post, his eyes open, but he didn't seem to see them. He had retreated into the private world of his own madness. "We have to go to town," Eleanor said, her voice a low, resolute whisper. "We have to get help." Lillian's eyes were filled with fear. "What will we tell them, Elle? They'll think we're crazy. They'll put us away." "We'll tell them the truth," Eleanor said, a lie she needed to believe herself. "We'll tell them he's sick, that he's lost his mind. They'll understand." They packed a few things, their hands fumbling with the weight of the moment. As they were about to leave, Eleanor looked at the coffin key in her hand, a small, cold piece of metal that had saved their lives. She put it in her pocket, a memento of their terrifying ordeal, a reminder of what they had endured. The walk to town was long and arduous. The sun beat down on them, and the road, once a familiar path, now seemed like a long, dangerous journey into the unknown. They walked in silence, each of them lost in her own thoughts. Eleanor thought of Thomas, of their mother, of the family they had been, and the broken, shattered thing they were now. When they finally arrived in town, a small, dusty outpost, they went straight to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a large, kindly man with a weary face, listened to their story with a growing look of disbelief. He was patient and kind, but Eleanor could see the doubt in his eyes. "I understand you've been through a lot, girls," he said, his voice gentle. "The war, it's a terrible thing. It can do things to a person's mind. He dismissed their story as a product of grief and trauma. He promised to send someone out to check on their father, but Eleanor knew he was just humoring them. She felt a profound, chilling sense of defeat. They had survived their father's madness, but they were now trapped in a new kind of prison. A prison of disbelief, a prison of a world that refused to see the truth. They had to go back. They had to face the reality that they were alone and that the monster they had captured was still a part of their lives, a part of their family. The walk back was 100 times harder than the walk to town. The road seemed endless, and the familiar landscape of their home now seemed like a foreign, dangerous place. They were home, but they were no longer safe. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The true horror had just begun. The return to the farmhouse was a descent into a new kind of horror. It was no longer the terror of the unknown, but the cold, quiet dread of a known evil. Their father, still bound in the cellar, was a silent, living monument to their suffering. He no longer thrashed or screamed. He just sat there, his eyes vacant, his mind 1,000,000 miles away. His silence was more terrifying than his rage. It was the silence of a broken man, a silence that hinted at something deeper, something far more sinister than simple madness. Eleanor and Lillian moved through the house like ghosts, their actions dictated by a shared, unspoken fear. They would go about their daily chores, but every task was a reminder of their captivity. The kitchen, once a place of warm, loving memories, was now a place of cold, silent meals. The parlor, once a room of family gatherings, was now a room of chilling, empty air. Lillian, who had been on the verge of a breakdown, now seemed to find a strange, unsettling calm. She would go down to the cellar and sit with their father, her eyes fixed on his. She didn't speak to him. She just watched him, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. Eleanor, disturbed by her sister's behavior, asked her what she was doing. "I'm trying to see him, Elle," Lillian whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "I'm trying to see who he is now, the monster or the man." Eleanor knew the answer. The man was gone. There was only the monster now. But Lillian was not convinced. She was still searching for a glimmer of the father she had lost, a memory of a time before the war, before the telegram, before the sickness. One afternoon, a week after their trip to town, Lillian went down to the cellar. She didn't come back up. Eleanor, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach, went down to check on her. The cellar door was ajar. She pushed it open and a rush of cold, musty air filled the space. Lillian was sitting on the ground, her hands on her father's, and she was crying. But they were not tears of fear. They were tears of profound, heartbreaking grief. Jeremiah was still tied to the post, but his head was bowed, his face buried in his hands. He was sobbing, not with the wild, unholy wails of a madman, but with the deep, broken sobs of a man who was finally, truly and utterly defeated. "He came back, Elle," Lillian whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He came back." Eleanor stared at the scene, her mind a frantic scramble. The monster she had been so sure of was gone, replaced by a broken, weeping man. Was this an act? A new, more insidious game, or was it real? Had the silence, the isolation, finally broken through his madness? Eleanor didn't know. She only knew that the man she saw before her was a stranger, a man she had been prepared to kill, a man she had bound and locked away like an animal. And now, he was crying. She went down the stairs, her feet silent on the cold ground. She knelt beside her sister, her hand on her back, a silent comfort. They had survived his rage, his madness, his plan. But now, they had to face something new, something far more complicated and far more terrifying, his grief. The horror had changed. It was no longer a physical threat, but a psychological one, a slow, agonizing slide into a deep, emotional chasm. They had to decide if they could ever forgive him, if they could ever be a family again, if the man they had known was ever coming back. The coffin key in Eleanor's pocket felt like a mockery, a reminder of a plan that had been foiled, a plan that had led them to this moment. They had survived, but they were not free. They were trapped in a new kind of prison, a prison of a broken family, a prison of a broken home. The following days were a study in contradiction. Jeremiah, no longer bound, moved through the house with a quiet, shuffling gait. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were lucid, if heavily laced with sorrow and regret. He would sit on the porch, staring at the fields, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep grief. He never mentioned the cellar, the coffins, or the rituals. He acted as if they had never happened, as if that man, the monster who had been his jailer, had been a different person entirely. Lillian, who had always been the more emotional of the two, accepted this new reality with a desperate, painful relief. She would sit with him, hold his hand, and try to fill the silence with talk of the garden, of the neighbors, of a future she desperately wanted to believe in. Eleanor, however, remained vigilant. She watched him from a distance, her eyes narrowed, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She couldn't forget the glint in his eyes, the words in his journal, the plan he had meticulously crafted. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Jeremiah called them to the parlor, the same room where the nightmare had begun. The air was heavy, charged with a strange, unsettling energy. He sat them on the couch, and for the first time in months, his eyes met hers. The light in them was not of madness, but of a quiet, profound despair. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I need to tell you about what happened. I need to explain." Lillian's eyes were filled with tears of hope. Eleanor's eyes were filled with a cold, hard resolve. He began to speak, and his words were a slow, agonizing confession. He spoke of the telegram, of Thomas's death, and of the grief that had consumed him. He said the war had been a divine punishment, and he had been chosen to cleanse his family of sin. He spoke of his delusions as if they were a foreign country he had visited, a dark and terrifying place he had finally returned from. But it wasn't just grief, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I felt a presence, a voice in my head, a voice that told me what to do, a voice that told me that you and Lillian, that you were a sin, that you were not mine. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The whispers in the wall. It wasn't just his madness. It was something else. She looked at Lillian, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The presence," he said, his eyes filled with a terrifying, profound sadness. "It came from a place in the house, a place I never told anyone about. My father's journal. It was in there, a record of his own demons." He then rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He went to the fireplace, and with a heavy heave, he pushed on a brick in the back of the hearth. The brick slid inwards, revealing a small, dark space. He reached inside and pulled out a small wooden box, old and worn. He opened it and pulled out an old, leather-bound journal. It was not the journal Eleanor had found in the attic. This one was older, its pages yellowed with age. "This was my father's," he said, his voice a tremor. He wrote about his own sickness, his own demons. He wrote about a presence in the house that had been passed down from his father and his father's father before him. A curse. He held the journal out to them. A final, terrible inheritance. "I'm not the monster, Eleanor. The house is the monster. It's in the walls. It whispers. It takes hold of the men in my family and fills them with a cold, a terrible purpose." Eleanor, her hand still clenching the coffin key in her pocket, felt a profound, bone-deep chill. The horror was not a man's madness, but a generational curse, a legacy of evil that had been passed down from father to son for generations. The horror was not in the man, but in the house, in the walls, in the very air they breathed. The storm outside finally broke, a ferocious onslaught of wind and rain. The thunder rattled the windows, and lightning illuminated the room in stark, frightening flashes. The house, their home, was a living, breathing monster. and they were its prisoners. The horrific curse of the Whitlock family was not the man, it was the home, the very ground they lived on. The evil was a part of the house, a sickness in the walls, and the Whitlock sisters were its final, terrifying victims. They had survived their father's madness, only to face a new, more terrifying truth. The curse was real, and it was just beginning. Jeremiah placed the old, leather-bound journal on the hearth, its worn cover a testament to years of silent suffering. He then looked at his daughters, his face a mix of profound grief and a terrifying, final clarity. "The house holds it," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "The sickness, the whispers, it takes hold of the men in my family, and it changes them. It makes them purifiers." Eleanor's mind reeled. She had believed the horror was her father's alone, a personal madness born of grief. But now she saw a new, more sinister truth. This was not a single event. It was a legacy of evil, a dark inheritance passed down through generations. She looked at Lillian, whose face was pale, a mixture of terror and dawning, horrified comprehension. Jeremiah continued, his words a flood of agonizing confession. He spoke of his own father, a man he had loved but also feared, a man who, in his final years, had become withdrawn, obsessive, and cruel, a man who had built a locked room in the cellar, a room no one was ever allowed to enter. "He died in that room," Jeremiah said, his voice a tremor. "My mother told me he died of a sickness, a fever. But now, I know it was the house." He then looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading light. "It tried to do to me what it did to him. It tried to make me do what it made him do. But I fought it. I fought it for you and your sister." Eleanor's heart, a cold, hard stone in her chest, began to crack. She had hated him, feared him, but she had never considered that he was also a victim. The monster she had fought was not just a man, but an evil presence that had been festering in the walls of their home for a century. The whispered threats, the cruel rituals, the obsession with purification. It was all part of a dark, generational narrative. He then took a small tarnished silver key from a pouch on his belt. It was a key she had never seen before. "My father gave me this on his deathbed," he said, holding it out to her. "He told me to never open the locked room, to never go in there. He said it was for the good of the family. He said it was the source of the curse." Eleanor stared at the key. It was a physical link to a past she never knew, a past that had now, in the most horrifying way, become her present. She took the key, the cold metal a heavy weight in her palm, the weight of her family's past, the weight of her father's suffering. "I tried to get rid of it," he said, his voice breaking. "I buried it. But the whispers, they told me to dig it up. They told me I needed it. They told me it was my purpose." He then looked at Lillian, his eyes filled with a profound, bone-deep sadness. "I'm so sorry, my daughters. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, for what I almost did to you. I love you more than life itself." Lillian, who had been sitting in a state of silent shock, now rose and went to her father, her arms wrapping around him in a tight, desperate embrace. She had found the man she had lost, and she was not letting him go. Eleanor, however, remained where she was, the key a burning weight in her hand. She had a new purpose now. The horror was no longer in the cellar, but in a locked room, a room that held the key to the family's past and to their terrifying future. She had to open it. She had to find out what was inside. She had to confront the source of the curse. The storm outside raged, a furious onslaught of wind and rain. The thunder rattled the windows, and lightning illuminated the room in stark, frightening flashes. The house, their home, was a living, breathing monster, and they were its prisoners. They had survived their father's madness only to face a new, more terrifying truth. The curse was real, and it was just beginning. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mold and rot. Eleanor stood before the locked room, the silver key in her hand, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Lillian stood beside her, her hand clutching Eleanor's arm, her face pale with fear. "Elle, please," she whispered. "Let's just leave. We can leave him and go. We can start over." But Eleanor shook her head. "We can't, Lil. Not now. We have to know. We have to find out what's in there. If we leave, the curse will just find us. We have to break it." She looked at her father, who stood at a distance, his face a mask of profound sorrow. He had confessed. He had begged for forgiveness. But he had also warned them. He had told them not to open the room, to just leave. But Eleanor knew she couldn't. The curiosity, a mix of hope and dread, was a powerful driving force. She slid the key into the lock. It was old and rusted, but with a groan of protest, it turned. She pushed the door open, and a rush of cold, stale air, heavy with the scent of old paper and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet, rushed out. The room was small and dark, a single flickering lantern illuminating the space. The walls were covered in old, tattered drawings, crude sketches of people, of animals, of things that were not quite human. A large wooden desk sat in the center of the room, and on it, a single book lay open. It was a journal, not the one her father had given her, but a different one. It was filled with her grandfather's frantic, spidery handwriting. He had written about the sickness, about the whispers, about the purification. But the journal also contained something else. It contained drawings of a family tree that went back for generations. It showed the names of the men in the family, and beside each name, a drawing of a small human figure with a single dark line drawn across its throat. It was a record of every man in the family who had succumbed to the curse, a record of a history of murder, of fathers killing their children in the name of a twisted, generational madness. But the most horrifying discovery was a small, ornate key sitting on the open page of the journal. It was the same kind of key as the one in her pocket, the key to a coffin. It was not a single key, it was one of many. And the journal contained drawings of a series of hidden burial sites, all on the property, all marked with a small wooden cross. The whispers began again, not from the walls but from the pages of the journal itself. They were louder now, more urgent, more insistent. They were not her father's voice, but a chorus of voices, a symphony of madness, a dark, malevolent presence that had been waiting for them for 100 years. "They are waiting for you." A voice, a thin, reedy sound, whispered from the pages. "They want you to join them, to be purified, to be one with us." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The sickness was not just in the walls, it was in the family. It was a curse passed down from father to son, a dark generational legacy of murder and madness. Her grandfather and her father's father before him had not been mad. They had been possessed. They had been hosts for a dark, malevolent entity that had been feasting on the fear and the grief of the family for generations. A sound from the stairs made her heart leap into her throat. Jeremiah. He was coming down. He had followed them. He had been waiting for them to open the door. He was a part of the curse, a part of the family's dark, terrible history. She looked at the drawings of the burial sites, and a cold, hard resolve settled in her heart. She had to fight, not just for her life, but for the lives of every woman in her family who had been a victim of this terrible curse. She had found the truth. Now, she had to find a way to break it. The whispers were getting louder, more frantic, more insistent, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the curse was not just in the past. It was here in the present, and it was waiting to take hold of her.